So this is part B of the Khoodeelaar television channel being broadcast at 08:10 hours GMT. That is 10 past 8 in the morning in London, within quotes, UK, on Friday, the 4th of June, 2021. And this is what the trendily called the pink one, the Financial Times. We call it the Financial Crimes because once again the Financial Crimes is contradicting the evidence of its own publication about the trend in the economy, so-called economy, the UK. Now, this is a program, we call it uniquely, exclusively call it the world exclusive diagnosis of Fleet Street. And this is the shortest possible expression of the very long list of tasks that we undertake and carry out every time, every edition, and throughout. And the reason why we call it diagnosis is because we believe that the Fleet Street media, the so-called British media, the print media, and the corresponding broadcasting outlets like the BBC News, Sky News, ITV News, Channel 4 News, and the rest of the print outlets published across the country and especially across Little England. The combined kind of effect and impact and the role of all these titles and outlets is sickness, because there are purveyors and conveyors and couriers of lies and untruths and propaganda and spin and fabrication, fake news, misinformation, and the rest of it. So, when we say that the Financial Times is really the Financial Crimes, we think of things like this one that it is perpetrating this morning. It says, Johnson faces revolt. There is no revolt at all. There has been no revolt by the British members of Parliament in the conventionally, objectively understood sense of the term. There have been conspiracies, but most of those conspiracies have been done to facilitate and to promote and to spew far-right, right-wing, racist agendas and actions and activities and programs. And most of the revolt by any members or any groups of members of Parliament took place against the European Union in the Conservative Party. But currently, there is no revolt in the Conservative Party, as in the House of Commons. But the Financial Crimes is repeating and copying and imitating a corrupt agenda and corrupt line by using the term revolt. The only revolt in the last 6 calendar years has been against Jeremy Corbyn by the right wing of the British political kind of establishment that has infiltrated, taken over the Labour Party. And one of the personifications and embodiments of that takeover is Keir Starmer, who is essentially a conservative in the sense of being right-wing and in the sense of being racist and in the sense of being imperialist and in the sense of being against the human rights of the victims of apartheid, massacre, and genocides. across the world, including the massacres and displacement, disenfranchisement, robbery of the Palestinian people. Keir Starmer, we have asserted on the evidence, has politically murdered the Labour Party. And he has politically committed suicide. And the suicide note was broadcast by his co-racist criminal, liar Piers Morgan. That is the suicide note. Because instead of addressing the real live issues that affect the many, Starmer decided to confess that he is politically dead and he has politically murdered the Labour Party. To the murderer of anything politically kind of desirable and necessary and relevant to the needs and the struggles of the many in this country, namely Piers Morgan. And there will be in the kind of next week, on the 13th of June 2021, the launch of the ghastly biased broadcasting operation to accentuate the mainstream media lying and denials of rights of people in the form of the GB, fronted by the brilopad Andrew Nasty Neil. Andrew Nasty Neil is a congenital liar who has not been called congenital liar so many times as Boris Johnson has been, but he is in collusion, is complicit with Boris Johnson and the other liars whom the media have been giving platforms to perpetrate lies against the many. And these people are samples, if you like, embodiments and samples and representatives or representative examples of the sickness that we diagnose. So it's not just the formal official incumbents in the quote media in Fleet Street by these people, but the ideology, the agenda, the greed is good agenda that Boris Johnson personifies, that are carried and spewed and promoted by Fleet Street. So going back to this question on the financial crimes briefing, calling Johnson faces revolt on foreign aid cuts, there is no revolt. If a majority of 80 odd members of parliament is an active majority, that the most of the people in the Conservative Party are not likely to suffer any illness, fatal illness, then even 20 people, 30 people, even 40 members of parliament, fitting the description of being involved in the revolt, won't make any difference in electoral terms and in terms of the votes in the House of Commons. Number one, that is the mathematics of it. It is not revolt. It is a ripple, but it's not a revolt. Because the Labour Party does not simply have the numbers to cancel and overcome the numerical guaranteed landslide majority that Jeremy Corbyn's stupidity gave to Boris Johnson in December 2019. So if the MPs who are supposedly making noise about the cut to foreign aid by the UK government fronted by Boris Johnson, even if they spoke, even if they voted, they won't be able to defeat Johnson's government. That is not something that is evident so far, because it doesn't say that overwhelming numbers of MPs are opposed to the cuts. So the details of that revolt, which is not an original piece in the Financial Crimes, it is a spin by some lobbyists. And it says manifesto pledge. And it says the Johnson faces Tory revolt on move to cut foreign aid budget. Let's see what the So Boris Johnson is facing a revolt by senior Tory MPs over his plan to cut foreign aid in an ambush that comes just days before he hosts a G7 summit focused on the developing world. Now, this kind of introduction is absolutely loaded with racist stupidity and patronizing and matronizing idiocies and lies. Number one, that Johnson is not facing a revolt. And the second thing is that there is an ambush. There is no ambush. If elected members of parliament or elected members of any assembly are referred to as carrying out an ambush when they raise objections to what they individually think is unfair and unacceptable, that is not an ambush. That is not a revolt. That is what they are supposed to do as elected members of the assembly or the parliament. So it's stupidity, dishonesty. And the third thing is that he hosts a G7 summit focused on the developing world. Now, developing world is an outrageous lie, as has been shown by Johnson's sick-making idiocy and stupidity to rush to India to cultivate Narendra Modi's regime as part of the Brexiteering agenda to get business with India, between India and British economics. India is not smaller than British economy, is it? And there are other countries that are categorized as developing, which are not really correctly described as developing, because developing means that they are, in comparison with the UK, the USA, Canada, and Germany, economically behind and backward. They are not, because in India, there are more billionaires than most of the Western European countries have. And India has got nearly 1.5 billion people, the equivalent of. And the whole of the European continent, except Russia, has got less people than India has. In fact, even including Russia, I think the population would be less than the population of India. So let's see what the financial criminals are calling the developing countries. Let's look at the definition of developing. Definition that is entered in the entry of the Wikipedia itself, which we always use with a pinch of salt. So, the list of developing countries as published by one of the outlets, which is dated 2018 now, ISGE 2018.isgesociety.com. So reduced rate is applicable for delegates from the following countries. Now this is the in definition of that organization. So let's see if we can find the developing. So according to this entry, it says, what are the top 5 developing countries? And in the answer to this question, is the all right, so the economic development entry on the Wikipedia. This is a long entry. So let's look at the brief one that we can use for the purpose of this broadcast inclusion in this broadcast. The precise definition of economic development has been contested absolutely correctly. While economists in the 20th century viewed development primarily in terms of economic growth, sociologists instead emphasize broader processes of change and modernization. Development and urban studies scholar Carl Seligman summarizes economic development as a process of creating and utilizing physical, human, financial, and social assets to generate improved and broadly shared economic well-being and quality of life for a community or a region. Daphne Greenwood and Richard Holt distinguish economic development from economic growth on the basis that economic development is a broadly based and sustainable increase in the overall standard of living for individuals within a community. And measures of growth such as per capita income do not necessarily correlate with improvements in quality of life. Economic development is a wider concept and has qualitative dimensions. Economic development implies economic growth plus progressive changes in certain important variables which determine well-being of the people, that is health, education. The University of Iowa Center for International Finance and Development states that Economic development is a term that practitioners, economists, politicians, and others have used frequently in the 20th century. The concept, however, has been in existence in the West for centuries. Modernization, westernization, and especially industrialization are other terms people have used while discussing economic development. Economic development has a direct relationship with the environment. Though the concept's origin is uncertain, some scholars argue that development is closely bound up with the evolution of capitalism and the demise of feudalism. Others link it to the post-colonial state. Mansell and Wen also state the economic development has been understood by non-practitioners since the World War II to involve economic growth, namely the increases in per capita income, and if currently absent, the attainment of a standard of living equivalent to the industrialized countries. Economic development can also be considered as a static theory that documents the state of an economy at a certain time. According to Schumpeter and Backhouse, 2003, the changes in this equilibrium state to document in economic theory can only be caused by intervening factors coming from the outside. And there are other kind of details. And as the references are extensive, too extensive to be covered in a limited length of a program like this, for even if it goes on hours, the actual details would entail several days length of reading. Essentially, it is corrupt to say developing countries, which include India, countries like India, because India itself is not a country as much as a federation of countries in every sense of the word. And within the constituent federation, say for example, in the western and northwestern parts of India and the southwestern parts of India, the per capita income and various facilities are different from those available in the northeastern parts of India and eastern parts of India as it is. And within the states themselves, there are differences of income, differences of affordability, wealth distribution, and so on. So developing countries is a false and misleading phrase to use. What they should be using is countries with poverty and lack of rights. Now, if they define that, then they would have to accept that the UK, the USA, Canada, Germany are themselves developing countries, because within these countries and within these societies there exists serious kind of imbalances, disparities at every level. And in terms of the UK, coming back to the UK, the disparities caused by racism, institutional racism, and racist practices and barriers exemplified by the behavior of Brenda and the monarchy, as has been admitted in the latest revelations. These are as serious and severe as some of the disparities and deprivations that can be found in the so-called developing countries, as defined by the financial crimes, or as referred to by the financial crimes. And the other thing that we accuse the financial crimes of perpetrating every single edition is the absence of any reference to the absence of any references to the realities of life in society for the many in this country. And we go back to referring to Ian Dracula Duncan Smith. Ian Dracula Duncan Smith was the longest in post as the deprivation, want, and poverty creation perpetrator who caused the forced suicides of more than 1,000 people in this country. Now, this is massacre. And so every level of safety and security of life and livelihood in the UK is based on bias, discrimination, and disparity. And those are perpetrated by class, so-called, and also race, ethnicity, and in the context of Britain, the hostility, the hostile environment as aimed at people based on ethnicity and faith. And the worst aggravation of these perpetrations are perpetrated against people of the Caribbean, as has been discovered too late, if you like, because of the reports about the hostile environment that the nasty Home Secretary Theresa May revived and reinstated in the behavior of the UK interior departments and agencies towards people of the Caribbean, African Caribbean backgrounds. And of course, the same type of hostility based on hostile and antagonistic attitude towards Muslims is widely available on the evidence, mostly the empirical evidence of the people who have been victimized by these policies. And these policies remain as active today, the 4th of June 2021, as they had ever been in the decades, at any time in the decades preceding. Now, the racism of this country or the government is admitted, but this is the latest and kind of contemporary evidence of the reason why we should call the Financial Times the Financial Crimes, because look at the editorial kind of racism and stupidity evident in this headline. It's under headline High Court, and it is a heading that reads, Judge rules asylum seekers were housed unlawfully. Now, that is completely false and misleading, because anyone reading just that heading and not reading the actual details of the report underneath would be literally justified to conclude that housing asylum seekers was the unlawfulness of the behavior of the government. But that's not what this story is about, but that is the headline. So the headline serves the prejudice against asylum seekers, reinforcing the ignorant view and the racist view that asylum seekers are not entitled to equal rights to housing, any other treatment and care in society. So it says, judge rules asylum seekers were housed unlawfully. So these are the words, asylum seekers housed unlawfully. That is to say, their housing was unlawful. Not the unlawful, that the unfit for human habitation conditions in which they were housed. That was in the ruling by the High Court. So, so that is the linguistic vehicle perpetrating the hostility towards asylum seekers. And these are people not employed in the Home Office. These are not people that have investigated the behavior of the Home Office. These are people who have taken the copy or copies issued by some agencies, and they're imitating that. But they are imitating that by branding the housing of the asylum seekers as being the unlawful thing, which is completely the opposite to what this story that this headline is about. So let's read the piece underneath. The government acted unlawfully, but again the beginning is wrong because it puts at the front of the paragraph the housing of the asylum seekers. That is the main operative phrase after the description of government acted unlawfully. It is not that, but that is how they are misinterpreting the report, because what the unlawfulness was in the military barracks that the government used to house the asylum seekers. The barracks were not fit for human habitation, the living standards. So the full paragraph with these explanations, diagnostic explanations, the government acted unlawfully by housing asylum seekers in a former military barracks that failed to meet minimum living standards, the High Court ruled yesterday, in the latest of a series of criticisms of the facility's use. Facility meaning that former military barracks. The 6 men who brought the case were housed in Napier Barracks at Folkestone in Kent. In accommodation, their lawyers said was squalid, which had a COVID-19 outbreak in January. Mr. Justice Thomas Linden found that the Home Office failed to ensure an adequate standard of living for the men. Now that's where the main headline is. The High Court judge found that the Home Office failed to ensure an adequate standard of living for the man. That's what should have been the headline, but that is in the 3rd paragraph of the piece, in the financial crimes. And the 2 names that are shown as the byliners are the Jane Croft and Robert Wright. So there is a piece in the Guardian that is being referred to in various tweets about the corruption by Boris Johnson in making Peter Cruddas a member of the House of Peers. We shall talk about that later in this edition, but let's go back to the High Court item about the former military barracks in Kent called the Napier Barracks, which the Financial Crimes does admit was the subject of a scathing report in March by the independent chief inspectors of borders and immigration, which also said an outbreak there was inevitable. Now, Yvette Cooper, chair of the House of Commons Home Affairs Select Committee, in March published correspondence that suggested the Home Office had defied advice from public health bodies about using the site. In mid-January, 128 of the roughly 380 residents at the barracks tested positive for COVID-19, and the High Court judge, Mr. Justice Thomas Linden, found the COVID safety measures were contrary to the advice of Public Health England, and there was little ventilation in the dormitories, which were overcrowded when the question of risk of COVID-19 infection is taken into account. So this is actually the kind of substance that the Financial Crimes is admitting in the later parts of the misheaded item that add to the actual context and the background to the allegations made by a variety of sources, including families of victims of the COVID-19 massacres that were caused by the policy of Boris Johnson saying, let the thousands of bodies pile up. So that was a policy by Boris Johnson, and this is part of the policy being implemented by the Home Office that defied all the independent kind of advice and concerns and put people, asylum seekers, openly in a space that was bound to infect them and make them ill. And that was done to asylum seekers, 128 of them out of 380 residents got infected. And the Financial Crimes confesses the ruling means more claims could be brought by men who were housed at Napier during early 2021. Sue Willman, lawyer at Dayton Pierce Glynn, is the name of a firm of solicitors, licensed law traders. The firm that brought the case pointed out that people seeking asylum were especially vulnerable to physical and mental illness. Well, they were not vulnerable because of who they were, but they were vulnerable because of the discriminatory, oppressive, and uncaring, callous, and deadly treatment that they were meted out with and they were treated with. They have the right to be treated with dignity and should not be accommodated in detention-style barracks. Satbir Singh, Chief Executive of the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants, another participant in the case, said there was no place for sites like Napier, which is still home to 300 in UK communities. They must be shut down immediately, he said. The Home Office did not immediately say whether it planned to appeal. That is to say, when the Financial Crimes apparently contacted the Home Office after the ruling. So the Financial Crimes is carrying a contradictory piece today about the treatment by the Boris Johnson administration of asylum seekers. And we shall be talking about that more in due course. And the Financial Times is lying again in this one about manifesto pledge, because the last paragraph in that detail about Johnson facing the so-called Tory revolt on move to cut foreign aid budget, the very last paragraph actually contradicts that. Now, I said before reading this that it was not at all a revolt whatsoever, and it would not succeed. And here, the Financial Times is concluding in the last paragraph, the move that is Boris Johnson's cut from the 0.7% to the 0.5% that Rishi Sunak has done at Boris Johnson's orders. That move, that is the cut by Rishi Sunak, was first reported by the BBC. Opinion polls have shown the cut, which Downing Street has said would be temporary, is popular with the voters. Exactly. Who are the voters? The gullibles. The gullibles, the brainwashed, the ignorant, and the misinformed, who always vote the wrong way. And that is the consequence of having no political opposition party in Britain and no opposition MPs in the British Houses of Parliament. So we shall look at the possible detail in the ruling attributed to this Mr. Justice Thomas Linden. So the licensed law trader that the Financial Crimes has mentioned in the report about the Napier military barracks case for the High Court action is Sue Willman. And Sue Willman is praised beyond words. They are saying that Sue Willman well deserves her enviable reputation in public law. She works absolutely tirelessly for her clients and is great at thinking outside the box. We shall comment further on that case, on this propaganda for Sue Willman and the firm, after giving them due process opportunity to answer questions that we shall be putting to them directly, not in this broadcast, but directly. And the questions will be about this claim and about the assertion by ourselves that there is no fair legal system in this country, that the legal bureaucracy is corrupt and racist, despite the fact that this ruling by Mr. Justice Thomas Linden appears to be not a racist one, but we shall elaborate on that and we shall say that this is a racist one, despite the appearance. Now, the Financial Crimes on page 3 says that Peter Cruddas, yes, Cruddas is a confusing name with a Labour Party member of Parliament. There used to be John Cruddas. John Cruddas, we shall talk about John Cruddas in a later edition, especially his attitude about the popular councillors, whose role was being referred to during a visit by the American actress Angela Lansbury, who attended a gathering at the Bow Church, which I attended for evidence purposes. While I was trying to take pictures of Angela Lansbury, I was being spied on by a racist photographer that worked for several years, a woman from either Spain or Portugal, or somewhere in the continent, who was a racist spy who followed me around for several years through various events. And I shall talk about that racist criminal and a spy, because she must have submitted quite a lot of my photographs to the UK Home Office and other agencies, purely on her racist, anti-Muslim, hostile agenda and brief. So Cruddas is the name that I have just given an elaborate, actual, empirical, evidential reference to. Now this Cruddas, who is mentioned in this piece, Byline to Sebastian Paine. Sebastian Paine is spelled, the Paine is spelled Payne. Whether he is a distant descendant or relative of Thomas Paine is not clear, but we shall come to that later accordingly. But he is an ignorant member of Fleet Street, Sebastian Paine. Because Sebastian Paine was the only one who was attached to the Boris Johnson-linked right-wing racist Spectator at the time. He apparently attended a gathering of about 30 to 40 Bangladeshis, all Bangladeshis, near the Stepney School, shortly before the 2014 election, so-called, for the mayor, corrupt post of mayor. And that gathering was kind of confected mainly to benefit Lutfur Rahman in the then forthcoming so-called election that was held or staged on the 22nd of May 2014. And in his piece, Sebastian Paine, who was the only one that was known or accessible from Fleet Street, kind of reinforced the lying line that had a few minutes before him or a few hours before his post had been perpetrated by Ted Jury, The Ted Jury on that date was connected with the corrupt, racist Beaverbrook Express group at the time. So Sebastian Payne, like Ted Jury, is ignorant and shallow and racist on the evidence of their published contents. So that's the background to this one, who is mentioned as the byline to the story in Financial Crime about party funding. They're not talking about corruption, criminality. They talk about party funding. Party funding by itself is not corrupt or criminal. But most of the funds that the conservatives receive is corrupt and illegal and criminal. So this first paragraph says, a conservative donor gave the party £500,000 days after he took up his seat in the House of Lords following his nomination as peer by Boris Johnson. Now, a note here, a disclaimer. Whenever we read something from a newspaper or a website that includes the word Lord or Lords, we are merely quoting that particular part or section. We are not agreeing with the word Lord or Lords. Our editorial and policy line is to use that word or those two words, singular and plural, within quotes. Because we have got moral and ethical objection, total objection to any human being called Lord, or more than one human being called Lords. Okay, so the conservative donor gave the party £500,000 days after he took up his seat in the House of, within quotes, Lords, following his nomination as a peer. That's the House of Peers, which is acceptable to us as a linguistic word. So Peter Krudas, a city figure who financed the Vote Leave campaign during the Brexit referendum and Johnson's leadership bid, was introduced to the Lords on February 2nd, and according to the Electoral Commission, made the donation on February the 5th. Krudas, who founded CMC Markets, the spread betting group worth close to 1.2 billion, is one of the city's richest individuals. He resigned as Tory party treasurer in 2012 in a cash for excess scandal in which he was targeted in a sting reporters from the Sunday Times. Krudas's peerage was mired in controversy when the, quote, Lords Appointments Commission refused to endorse his nomination. Johnson took the unusual step of overruling the objection. At the time, Johnson noted that Krudas had apologized for any impression of impropriety and said that an internal party audit had found no intentional wrongdoing. Now, these are criminal assertions by Johnson. And the Financial Crimes should be pointing that out, that these are criminal falsification of false statements and collusion after the act by Johnson. So there is no mention of that. There is a long piece, but I'm not going to read the whole of it because it is completely contradictory and not going to be And there is a piece in the Financial Crimes about retirement pension and the women pensioners, state pension being underpaid. The tens of thousands more women than previously thought may be caught up in a state pension underpayment scandal, according to experts who say the additional bill could reach 650 million. Now, this is the kind of event that takes place every day. Anyone watching this program would know that we say that the state agencies and the UK central government department, so called, are absolutely corrupt. As we say that the judiciary is corrupt and racist, and so are the departments. So how is this possible? That underpayments to the extent of, as is being mentioned here in this piece in the Financial Crimes, 650 million could have taken place if there were kind of vigilant journalism in practice by Fleet Street. It couldn't happen. Because unlike the Financial Crimes, which doesn't have the tabloid style, shrieking, kind of crying, noisy, loud headings, for example, like this one. This is a splash on the front page of today's Murdoch Scum. Now, this should be the headline on this Scum front page. There's 650 million women, or 660 million pounds is the minimum amount that has been withheld from the government from women. And they've got this is the kind of Sean Lay photograph. Now, Sean Lay is one of the longest serving or longest in post BBC faces. And typically, quite apart from this is not worth running, is it? Because it was the heat. It has nothing to do with any criticism that can be made about him personally, on his character. The criticism that can be made, and which we are making hereforth, of Sean Lay is that he is a typical BBC liar, perpetrates lies with a straight face. And the lies are not just to the many in the UK, but the lies are perpetrated by broadcasting untruths about foreign dictators and anti-democratic oppressors and oppressive regimes and violators of human rights and basic kind of dignity of ordinary people and rights of ordinary people. We shall be commenting about the G7 summit a bit later. Now, we said about 2 days ago that the actual murderer who murdered the black policeman would be revealed as having had a sexual relationship with him, because everything about the timing, the place, the meeting point to their having a relationship. And here it is, but it's not the complete version, but here is the admission in the scum on page 7. And it is headed Ashcroft Cop Shot on Night of a Date. And it's by James Beale, US editor of the Scum. A police chief shot dead by Lord Ashcroft's daughter-in-law told pals he was going on a date the night he died. And that's the woman he was meeting. And Superintendent Henry Jamot, 42, joked he would take the identity of the mystery woman to his grave, a friend said. The officer boasted about his friendship with the Tory bigwig's family just hours before he was killed by socialite Jasmine Hartin, 32. Mr. Jamot's friend recalled, he said, I have a date. I asked who she was. He joked, that's my secret. This one I'm taking to my grave. And he did take it. The married dad of 5's body was found floating beside a pier in Belize. Hartin, who is married to Lord Ashcroft's son Andrew, says she shot him accidentally after giving him a massage. She has been charged with manslaughter and awaits a bail hearing. What on earth was she doing giving him a massage? And why her giving him a massage would be followed by her killing him, shooting him dead? So this one is going to be continued. So they're admitting that stabbings and murders have returned to the streets of England as the lockdown begins to be lifted. Now, going back to the developing countries, here is the Daily Mail that leads with this promotion for Carrie Simons' dress. Now, she's being hailed by the Daily Mail, as the first lady of fashion. And it's a piece by this really shameless woman called Liz Jones. She has absolutely no shame in promoting herself. Look at this. What is the point of this? And we shall come to that, because the summit is supposed to be being held within the UK. We shall come to updating comment on Cornwall, but not in this part, except to say that Cornwall is kind of expropriated by Little England and is treated as part of the Little England. Now, Cornwall is the site of the G7, and let's look at what they're saying about the G7. And the BBC is describing it, G7, Group of Seven, as an organization made up of the world's 7 largest so-called advanced economies. Well, it has used the phrase so-called at least. Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the UK, and the US. And the group sees itself as a community of values, sharing principles such as democracy and human rights. Now, this is exactly the lie that they are going to promote. Russia joined in 1998, creating the G8, but was suspended in 2014 for its takeover of Crimea and subsequently left the group for good. China has never been a member of the group, despite its large economy and having the world's biggest population. Its relatively low level of wealth per person means that it is not seen as an advanced economy in the way the G7 members are. Representatives from the European Union are usually present for the talks. India, South Korea, and Australia have also been invited as observers this year. G7 in numbers: 7 member countries, 1975 first meeting of the group of 6, 40% of the global GDP, 1/10 of the world's population, and 2014 Russia suspended over annexation of Crimea. And in this short piece about what does the G7 do, throughout the year, ministers and officials from the member countries hold meetings, form agreements, and publish joint statements on global events. The main event is the annual summit, where the leaders sit down to talk about the biggest issues of the day. The location of the summit depends on which country holds the presidency of G7 for that year. The UK is the 2021 president and announced in January that the meeting would take place in Carbis Bay in Cornwall. Last year's summit, which was due to be hosted by President Donald Trump, was cancelled because of the pandemic. It was the first year without a summit since the group first met in 1975. Now, the main topic of conversation this year will be COVID recovery and the preparedness against future crises. The UK's agenda also includes climate change and trade. Leaders will arrive on the Friday and meetings will get underway the following morning, with guest countries arriving that afternoon. Most of the conversations take place behind closed doors, but there are usually set-piece moments on camera, such as the gathering for the obligatory leaders photo. At the end of the summit, the host nation will publish a document called a communique, which outlines what has been agreed by the leaders, including the US's Joe Biden on his first visit to the UK as president. Prime Minister Boris Johnson is expected to hold a press conference on the Sunday. Will there be protests and more police? Protesting and policing are both more difficult this year because of COVID restrictions. Police have hired a cruise ship to help house officers off the shore of Falmouth in Cornwall. More than 5,000 extra officers on top of the 1,500 from Devon and Cornwall police are helping to control the summit. Demonstrators have been told they can gather in 4 approved protesting sites, including one in Exeter, which is more than 100 miles away. 100 miles away. Police have said they are not naive enough to expect that every protest will take place solely in those 4 sites. Climate activist group Extinction Rebellion expects 1,000 people at its protest in Cornwall. It has apologized in advance to local residents for disruption. And so it's saying that the G7 played crucial role in setting up a global fund to fight malaria and AIDS in 2002. The fund says it has saved 38 million lives since its creation. The G7 has been criticized as being out of date, partly because it does not include 2 of the largest countries in the world, India and China. In 2020, President Trump called it a very outdated group of countries. What does the G7 summit mean for Cornwall? Local leaders hope the summit will help boost Cornwall's economy, which has been badly hit by disruption to tourism during the pandemic. The region is seen by the government as central to the UK's green technology sector. Day-to-day life for locals and tourists will be affected as police have announced road and path closures. In some areas of nearby St. Ives, residents will have to provide proof of address in order to access homes. So there is a martial law in place against the civil liberties of the people of Cornwall, St. Ives. So that's the propaganda for Johnson and his wife. Well, what is his wife number? It is third wife. There is no and there is this piece about that item about foreign aid cuts. Let's see what the Daily Mail spin for Theresa May says. Theresa May last night joined a growing Tory revolt. Now that is the wrong word they're using as well, but we shall treat that as being the part of the narrative of Fleet Street stupidity, because we'll come to the other reason, the political reason why there cannot be any revolt by any British MPs really against cutting foreign aid or aid to poor countries or countries with poor economies. Theresa May last night joined a growing Tory revolt over foreign aid cuts that threatens to embarrass Boris Johnson just days before he hosts the G7 summit. 30 Conservative MPs now, that is what I said, it would be under 40. So these 30 Conservative MPs warned they will hijack legislation next week unless the overseas spending is restored. Mr. Johnson has slashed 4 billion from this year's aid budget by lowering the target to spend 0.7% of national income on international development to 0.75%. And defending the cuts, we shall come to that in a second, because Rishi Sunak has defended the Johnson cuts.